Hello, everyone, and welcome to the B2B Global Partnership thematic webinar series. Thank you for joining us from different parts of the globe. Today, I'm going to host this, and I will do the rounds of introduction before I hand it over to our speaker today. First, I will introduce our partnership, and then I will introduce our speaker, and then we'll listen to our speaker on the topic. So the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research and knowledge network with over 100 members from Asia, Africa, and also internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support the small-scale fisheries communities in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we define vulnerability and viability is not just in an economic sense, but also considering the political, the cultural, and ecological, environmental, and many other aspects that impacts human life. So vulnerability is more inclusive than we often think for the work of this partnership. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors, conditions, contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fishing communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa that includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the B2B partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series is an initiative of the partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, policy practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and this has been happening all through the 2021, and there is one also in December next month. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube, details regarding which can be found at www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's talk is the 11th in the series of webinars planned for 2021, and it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Jeremy Pittman as our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Pittman is an assistant professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. He also holds a number of adjunct professorship in multiple institutions that includes other departments and schools in University of Waterloo, but also in the University of Saskatchewan and also at the University of Prince Edward Islands, all in Canada. Dr. Pittman has received his PhD in social ecological sustainability from the University of Waterloo, with previous degrees in geography, both at his undergraduate and graduate levels from the University of Regina in Canada. Dr. Pittman's research focuses on governance and social ecological networks for community-based conservation and sustainability, with a focus on terrestrial and marine systems. He leads and co-leads several research projects, and one of those projects which is very, very significant and relevant for this particular event is titled as Fostering Transformations to Secure Sustainable Small-Scale Fisheries in Uruguay, which is funded by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO. I'm extremely delighted also to mention that Dr. Pittman is also a co-investigator of the V2V Global Partnership and an active leader of the project. I'm really honored to invite Dr. Pittman to deliver a talk to the V2V thematic webinar series today. And his talk is titled as Identifying Entry Points to Enhance the Adaptive Capacity of Small-Scale Fisheries Communities. Jeremy, it's over to you. And we're looking forward to hearing your speech.
Awesome. Thank you, Prateep. Very much appreciate your introduction. As Prateep was saying, my name is Jeremy Pittman. I'm an assistant professor, University of Waterloo School of Planning. And I'm going to talk to you today about this whole idea, like the title of my talk, Identifying Entry Points to Increase the Adaptive Capacity of Small-Scale Fishing Communities. And throughout my talk, I'll try to relate these to ideas of vulnerability and viability, and those concepts that are really important to the V2V partnership. Before I begin, I would just like to do land acknowledgement. You know, the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Office of Indigenous Relations. So in Canada, these ideas of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples are really important. And, you know, myself as an academic, someone that's part of Canada's education system, has a really important role to play in advancing reconciliation. I also just wanted to take a minute quick to acknowledge my collaborators and colleagues. So what I'll be presenting with you today, or to you today, is some work that's kind of a synthesis project. That's been work that's been going on for a few years. I'm going to focus on work that's been going on in Dominica, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But essentially, I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators and colleagues. So Riviere Sebastian, Zethar Baron, Derek Theophile, and Julian Dufault from the Fisheries Division in Dominica at the University of Waterloo, Maria Battaglia, Loine Hill, Derek Armitage, work with them quite a bit on a lot of this stuff. And my colleague, close friend from the University of West Indies in at the Mona campus in Jamaica, Donovan Campbell. So these people have all played a role in some way. I mean, I'm up here presenting, but it's kind of a network of people that helps foster a lot of this work, or helps get it done. So just a quick overview of my talk. So I wanted to give a bit of a background on adaptive capacity, how we think it works, and how it relates to concepts like vulnerability, viability, resilience, those types of things. And then I want to demonstrate in a case study from Dominica, how we might use some of those theories and those ideas and concepts to identify entry points for actually improving adaptive capacity in small-scale fishery communities. So on the first part, just generally, what is adaptive capacity? Adaptive capacity really found its roots in the vulnerability scholarship. So that's, you know, really related to climate change and things like that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had a lot of documents where they were, you know, defining vulnerability and thinking about how we actually set it up. The sort of the conceptualization that they landed on was this idea that vulnerability is related to exposure, which is how affected a system might be by a particular event or stressor. Sensitivity, which is basically how much that matters, like our livelihoods dependent or something like that kind of makes the system more sensitive. But also importantly, vulnerability was a function of this third concept called adaptive capacity, which is essentially how much a system is able to adapt to a stressor. And this diagram is from a really good paper by Nathan Engel, 2011, Global Environmental Change. It just shows how adaptive capacity in this conceptualization really moderates you know, exposure and sensitivity. It can affect both. So it can really change the exposure profile or the sensitivity profile of a community or of a system. And if you're increasing adaptive capacity, there's this idea that you're probably going to be reducing vulnerability. So the space here is smaller, so you have more vulnerability. With higher adaptive capacity in this part of the diagram, you have lower vulnerability. So that's kind of a general conceptualization of how adaptive capacity worked in this scholarship. But adaptive capacity is also really important in the resilience scholarship and in resilience thinking. And even though it's related to how it's thought about in the vulnerability scholarship, it still is conceptualized a little bit differently, just based on how resilience thinking conceptualizes systems a little differently, and those types of things. But essentially, the way adaptive capacity works under resilience framing, and again, this is from a paper by Nathan Engel. But so if you think about a system, different system states, where at the top here, in both parts, we have less desirable systems. At the bottom, we have more desirable systems. Systems sort of have this resilience aspect, or how do you maintain a system versus how do you transform it? And that's kind of that altered state that you're going for. And that's true of both the desirable and the least, or the more desirable and the least and the less desirable state. And the way that we think adaptive capacity works under resilience framing is kind of related to this idea where systems with less adaptive capacity are more likely to be in a less desirable state. Systems with more adaptive capacity are more likely to be in a more desirable state. So that just gives you a sense of how adaptive capacity works under a resilience framing. But so all that's really important. But today, what we really want to talk about is this idea of viability and vulnerability, and how these concepts like adaptive capacity can actually relate and potentially be used to increase the viability of small scale fishing communities. And so I did a quick literature search just to kind of see the papers on adaptive capacity, how do they kind of frame viability? And the term comes up quite a bit, but the concept is rarely given a lot of it's really given a lot of time, or I guess it's rarely defined very well, viability. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily defined in an academic sense. It's used more sort of colloquially in a lot of the literature, which is totally okay, right? But one of the things that I think the V2V partnership really has an opportunity to do is really develop this concept of viability and how it relates to these different other concepts like adaptive capacity and vulnerability and things like that. So this is just kind of a proposition that I would put forth, based on how these things relate. But when you're thinking about adaptive capacity in particular, I'd say, drawing on this kind of resilience framing, when you think about viability, it's probably a more desirable system state, right? So adaptive capacity is probably likely, if you have more adaptive capacity, it's probably likely that you have more viability in the small scale fisheries than if you have low adaptive capacity. So that's one sort of proposition that I would put forward. That's something I'd be happy to discuss after, actually, just to kind of see what everybody thinks about that. But that's kind of, yeah, anyways, that's one idea that I had when I was putting together this talk. And so moving on to how do we actually study adaptive capacity? How do we know, how do we diagnose it? How do we kind of know what's out there? How do we characterize it? How do we build theory about adaptive capacity? This is based on a really great paper by Charlotte Whitney, al., Ecology and Society from 2017. But essentially what this diagram is showing is all the different approaches and methods and things like that we use to study adaptive capacity. And a few key features of this diagram. So as you can see, the approaches range from those that are wholly ecological. So those are things like looking at large scale ecological indicators or models, or looking at species levels experiments, things like that. There's also social and ecological approaches. So that's things like integrated modeling, social experiments, participatory approaches, and then just generally mixed methods. But there's also fully social approaches. So that's where we're talking about things like governance analyses, doing sort of large scale social indicators, and then these groups of studies that are more like doing surveys in communities, or doing interviews, qualitative interviews in communities, or historical ethnographic approaches. The other thing I would mention that's really important from this diagram is this idea of scale. So as you can see, both in terms of social and ecological approaches, there's multiple scales that these different types of assessments are used for, or that they kind of help us understand. And the length of these arrows shows just the range of scales at which these different methods are usually applied, or they're more typically used. So you can see, like on the social side, anywhere from individual, household, community, that's where we're talking more sort of qualitative community-based approaches, surveys, ethnographic approaches. Once we get into higher scales, talking more about governance and indicators. And the same type of thing is relevant on the ecological side. So it ranges all the way from population or stocks or species, all the way up to the global ocean. The example that I'm going to show to you in a few minutes here is really drawing on, it's more in sort of the social part of this diagram. It's drawing on things like community based interviews, some surveys, but also some governance analyses. Excuse me. You're probably aware of this framework in this paper as well, but this is from another really great paper from Joshua Sinner et al. In 2018. And this paper presents this framework for how we think, or I guess what we think are the main dimensions or the main kind of key ingredients of adaptive capacity in coastal communities. And I think this diagram and this framework does a really great job of synthesizing a lot of learning that had occurred previously in terms of how we think adaptive capacity works. And it starts off with assets, and a lot of the initial adaptive capacity assessments really focus on assets, the capitals type approach or the livelihoods type approach, where you're looking at different assets that people have access to or not, and how that kind of shapes things like adaptation and vulnerability. So that, that's really key. That features really high in this framework as well. But this framework also does a good job of drawing in some of these other elements that, there's been lots of good scholarship around how these things work emerging over the last few years as well. So that includes this idea of flexibility. So how can people kind of change courses, or how do they prepare? So how do you kind of, make changes here or make interventions here that allow a community or a fishery to have multiple options, right? So those ideas of flexibility can be pretty important. That's sort of, in some ways that's sort of the opposite, not exactly the opposite, but it's kind of the opposite of things like path dependence and being locked in and traps and that type of thing. How do we kind of make these systems more flexible and allow them to change in multiple ways, adapt to different stressors in multiple ways? We also have this dimension or this theme of organization. And, as the diagram suggests, this is where you get into more of the structural elements of adaptive capacity. So how do networks within the communities work to determine who can adapt and who can't? But it also gets into broader networks. How do, networks between fisheries cooperatives and national governments, how do those sort of facilitate adaptation or not? Similarly, that those ideas of levels and scales become really important. And, if you think about interactions from the international sphere, this is kind of where a lot of those structural characteristics sort of fit in the adaptive capacity framework. The next piece is learning. And that's basically, how people are able to process new information, stuff like that. Derek Armitage has done a lot of really interesting work in this sphere. And, basically what you're trying to relate is how new information is processed, how people make sense of things, and how they're able to apply that new knowledge to address, emerging or new situations. And finally, agency is really important in this framework. So that's where, people, it's about giving people options and allowing them to develop the livelihoods and the communities that they want. Kind of related to the idea of self-actualization, where, this part is really about people sort of pursuing fishing and, developing their communities in ways that align with their value systems, and just like, developing the futures that they want, kind of thing. So all these dimensions taken together are usually, that's how we kind of think of adaptive capacity. And that's, we try to assess these different elements when we're doing adaptive capacity assessments. And again, just kind of trying it back to these ideas, this is probably a framework that's mostly applicable in sort of the social side of things. And finally, one of the other things that's really important in adaptive capacity literature, and again, this is drawing on ideas from Nathan Engel in 2011, but there's sort of this these two sort of related, but these two different or distinct approaches in the adaptive capacity literature. And the first, and this is the one that gets applied the most, but essentially it's that idea of applying theory. So that's where we look at a system or a community and we try to diagnose or characterize what sort of capacity is in the community based on indicators, or, indicators can be applied deductively. So we have a set of indicators and we want to kind of get information on these indicators from a community, by doing surveys or something like that in a community, or the indicators can be developed more inductively, where you go out and you talk to people about what helps them adapt, and qualitatively and more inductively you draw out what those indicators are. But nonetheless, that's sort of happening in this sphere, and that's kind of related to this idea of building theory. The inductive piece especially helps us build theory. The deductive piece helps us test hypotheses and things like that. So, there's also this idea of how do we actually test some of our hypotheses or our assumptions around how we think adaptive capacity works in a lot of places. And that's kind of where the building theory comes in. That's, in these cases, that's where you're trying to measure capacity in a little bit more of a robust way, I would say, and you're trying to compare that to outcomes. How do we know that these things like learning or these things like agency, what sort of measurable outcomes do they lead to in communities? This piece, I would say, can be very challenging, and the majority of scholarship is sort of focused in this piece. But this piece is obviously pretty important. One of the challenges, and one thing that's really important when you think about adaptive capacity is it's often kind of a latent variable. So it's something that exists out there. Like a system or a community or an individual household can have capacity, but that doesn't always mean that they apply capacity either, right? So, capacity is kind of this latent thing, which makes it very difficult to measure in an objective way. So that's one sort of challenge with building theory. The work that I'm going to present to you here in a minute probably falls mostly in this applying theory piece, but it's from a project that actually we were hoping to do more of this, but the pandemic kind of ruined our plans for that. Hopefully we were able to pick it up more in the future, but for now, I'll talk to you more about this idea of sort of applying some of the theory and diagnosing or characterizing how you might increase adaptive capacity in small scale fishing communities. And so, so as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be based on a case study from Dominica. So Dominica, for those that don't know, it's an island in the Eastern Caribbean. It's not the Dominican Republic. That's one thing. A lot of people get the two confused because of the similarities in their names. But you can see they're kind of they're both in the Caribbean, right? But Dominica is a separate island over on this part of the Caribbean, close to Guadeloupe, Martinique, and St. Lucia. The work that I'm going to show to you today is sort of a synthesis across multiple rounds of interviews and some surveys. So I started working in Dominica in 2014 when I was doing my PhD work, and I have about 56 interviews, qualitative semi-structured interviews that are looking at ideas of governance and drawing on some of those themes. I did some follow-up work in 2018 as part of a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada project, where we did 24 interviews. These were more with community members, looking at how people were able to adapt or not to different conditions, including Hurricane Maria, which went through the island in about 2017, I believe it was. So we were looking at how what adaptive capacities people applied to get through those types of situations. And more recently, 2019 to 2020, we were doing fishing trip surveys, so kind of dockside surveys in some of the communities. And this is the part we were hoping to use a little bit more for the building theory part of adaptive capacity. But we got disrupted by the pandemic. But essentially, based on the data we have so far, I have about 344. We have about 344 or data from about 344 fishing trips that is informing this talk as well. That just gives you kind of a sense of the data that we're using. Most of what I'll present to you today is based on sort of a qualitative content analysis of the interviews with a few descriptive statistics from the surveys. So the first piece, and this probably isn't a surprise to a lot of people that work in small scale fishing communities, but essentially one way of really increasing the adaptive capacity and leading to viability is this idea of acknowledging the importance of community. And like as Prateep mentioned in the introduction, one of the things that's really unique and I think special about the V2V project is this idea where it's not just about economic vulnerability or economic viability, but these broader ideas of well-being and whatnot are kind of wrapped into these ideas of vulnerability and viability as well. And so when you think about, in that kind of context, in that kind of framing, just this idea of acknowledging the importance of community, I think is really important. This probably falls somewhat with the organization part of Sinner AL's framework. But essentially what this quote is demonstrating is just how people come together to pursue build their capacity, but also pursue viability in their fisheries. So as this quote demonstrates, they're working together to be more efficient, produce better quality fish, better standards. Also the learning piece kind of comes out here, where they have meetings and they talk about best ways that they can move forward. And the other thing I would mention here is, one thing that this quote really demonstrates is just how these different elements of adaptive capacity, they really interact to produce the outcomes that we see. And that's kind of represented here by these arrows. But as this quote demonstrates, both these ideas of organization and learning really come together in this example to sort of foster those capacities that improve the viability of the fishery. The next one is simply, promoting the love of fishing. And again, everybody that works in coastal communities probably gets a very good sense of this, but a lot of times, fishing isn't necessarily viewed as, a desirable occupation in a lot of cases. In some cases, it's viewed as almost some people's last resort, right? And, when you interview the fisher folk, you get a very different sense sometimes, where it's like, they really love fishing. It's something that they've chosen to do. They really they really are happy with their choice, and they don't really want to change, right? And as this quote is demonstrating, I'll just read it out here quickly. I like having all that I have from the sea, so I just stay in it. I just decide that I want to die in it. My life is in the sea, right? So it just shows like the level of commitment that some people have towards being in the small scale fishing's livelihoods, right? And that's one thing, like from an entry point for building adaptive capacity, just promoting that love of fishing, I think could be really important. One of the things that the Dominica Fisheries Division does in this regard that I think is really cool is they have a fish in schools program where basically they collect donations, they buy some fish, and they take it to different schools so that students can like eat locally caught fish and that type of thing. And there's sometimes there's events around it where they get to talk to fishermen or fisher folk and things like that. And it's just like a really interesting way of develop or sort of fostering this love of fishing with youth as well, which I think is really important. The next one is increasing options to sell. So based on some of the fishing trips that the fishing trip surveys that we were doing, approximately 73% of the catch from the trips in our sample was sold directly to community members. So that's a fairly high percentage. Which is both important. There's about, roughly a quarter of it is going to what they would call wholesale, or it's being sold to restaurants and grocery stores and things like that. So that's obviously an important part. Dominica, like a lot of Caribbean islands, does have a lot of tourism. It's maybe not the main economic driver in Dominica, which is distinguishes it a little bit from some of the surrounding islands, but it is still there and it is still important. So this idea of selling catch to restaurants and stuff like that, it is important in Dominica, but the majority still goes to directly to community members. So there's this idea that increasing some of the options to sell is probably could be important for livelihoods in this case. Whoops. One of the things though that is also interesting. So in this context where a lot of the fish that people catch is directly marketed to community members, it provides this interesting element of social capital as well that is can kind of foster adaptive capacity. And this quote just shows, I won't read all of this one, but this quote just shows, so through the interactions that people have, buying and selling fish, it fosters these relationships where, in this case, the fisher was actually giving some of his catch to some of the elderly members of his community, just because they're sort of the most vulnerable sometimes in the community and whatnot. And it's not like fishers have a lot, right? Like they don't have a lot, but they're still willing to give sometimes, right? So that's kind of an important element of adaptive capacity that's fostered through these direct marketing interactions. And that's one thing that and I'll get to this a little bit more in a minute too, but so when you think about doing something like increasing options to sell, you want to make sure that you're doing that in a way that doesn't necessarily erode some of these benefits that we get from selling directly to community members. So that's kind of an interesting piece to consider and explore as well. And then the next piece is this idea of sort of balancing technology with local knowledge. And the example that I'll give is based on, this here is a freezer, right? And the use of freezers and ice and things like that are obviously really important for small scale fisheries. It drastically improves the quality of the fish, preserves it, that type of thing, makes it more healthy. There's less spoilage, less waste, all that kind of stuff. So it's a pretty important piece of it. But one of the things, so Dominica has had electricity for a long time, right? But as you kind of develop and you get more and more people with freezers and whatnot, both the fishers themselves, but also just the community members in their own homes, you almost create the situation where people become more and more dependent on having that electricity and having that ice and those freezers and stuff like that as well. And so during following the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, when the electricity was knocked out for a long time, like in some communities months, and people didn't have access to these freezers, it became kind of challenging to actually preserve some of the fish. And people were buying less at once and all that kind of stuff. But what kind of came to the forefront was this: a lot of it, not everybody knew how to do it anymore, but there was some local knowledge and kind of historic knowledge around how to preserve fish in terms of salting and drying and that type of thing. So that really became something that people were interested in expanding again, right? Just noticing how this sort of dependence on electric freezers had kind of changed the vulnerability profiles of a lot of communities. And that's kind of a point that I think is really interesting. And again, I think it's really important for the V2V project is this whole idea of, when you implement something, any kind of intervention, that it does sort of reduce vulnerability, or it does make it more viable. Having access to freezers and stuff like that probably does make the fishery more viable. But in some ways it changes the vulnerability profile, and in some ways you might become more vulnerable to other types of stressors, right? So in this case, like a hurricane that knocks out electricity. So these two interrelated concepts of vulnerability and viability, there, it's kind of like that idea of wicked problems, right? Like you do one thing and you maybe create new vulnerabilities to consider as well. And sometimes those can be really unforeseen and difficult to predict how those sort of emerge. The next piece is this idea of improving supplemental livelihoods, and what that means is just giving people more options as well. Even though they really love fishing and that type of thing, sometimes it's good to have some supplemental livelihoods as well. And what these pictures are showing is attempts to actually farm sea moss. So sea moss is an algae, like a seaweed, and it grows kind of naturally or it grows wild in these areas. What this project that's being developed by the fisheries division, again working with communities, is that what they're trying to do is actually try to see if this is the wild cause. This is like the natural species of sea moss. They want to see if it does well in farming in this area. So the way that you farm sea moss is you attach it using these this part here. You sort of attach it to these ropes, and then you go and you lay these ropes out in areas where sea moss would grow. And the idea is it makes it more easy to harvest, probably going to increase your production, all that kind of stuff. A lot of sea moss farming is done with non-local varieties though. And that's there's some concerns around that, just how that might impact biodiversity and just some uncertainty or just some perceptions that could be problematic. So what they were trying to do with this project is see if wild or locally appropriate varieties of sea moss would actually are they actually farmable here. So this is kind of an example. And then sea moss, they use it. They can sell it for consumption. Basically, they make a lot of drinks out of it and just products like that. So it provides a little bit of a supplemental livelihood. So just in summary of my talk here this morning, some of the key points. So this idea of adaptive capacity, it has roots in multiple disciplines, and it's studied using a diverse range of methodological tools. I demonstrated that sort of earlier. Drawing it directly to to viability, I would say that generally adaptive capacity helps to increase the viability of fisheries, but I'm not totally sure about that either, how those two relate, but it seems kind of that seems like a logical connection to make. We must both build and apply theory regarding adaptive capacity in order to meet the urgency of sustainability problems. So, what I kind of mean with that is we definitely need to build theory and test our assumptions and our hypotheses and that type of thing. But we also need to apply it, and maybe more operationally thinking about it in sort of an adaptive management approach where we can apply things, see if they work, and that type of thing. Just because the urgency of a lot of sustainability problems is they're coming a lot faster than like we can't really wait to build all of the theory, right? We need to kind of apply some of it and see how we do. And the other piece is just that whole idea of the attention to context is really important. As I was trying to demonstrate with my talk, a lot of those strategies that I mentioned, they're really sort of rooted in Dominica and in the communities where we worked. They might not work somewhere else. Some of them might, obviously, like they might work somewhere else, but essentially, when you're doing this type of thing, it's really needs to be context specific and kind of working with communities and things like that. Awesome. So that's all the talk that I have for you here today. I think we have time for questions and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was wonderful. And your talk kind of brings us into some of the core aspects that we have been trying to deal with within the V2B global partnership. There are multiple ways in which vulnerability and viability can be seen, understood, and and addressed and responded to within these specific communities. And as you have rightly said, the approach could be very different depending on whether you are in Dominica or whether you are in in one of the remotest communities in the other part of the world or something. So, but it's very, very thought-provoking and brings in many elements that we could kind of keep talking about. We still do not have any questions yet from our viewers on the YouTube. I would encourage everyone to just write your questions into the chat box, so we will read it out to Jeremy, and then Jeremy would like to answer that. I have a question which I received through another channel, is from Derek Armitage, and Derek is asking, scale is always a challenge in thinking through adaptive capacity. How do you make choices about what scale to use when examining adaptive capacity?
Yeah, always Derek asks the hard questions, right? But no, no. So it is very challenging. In a lot of the work that I do, we sometimes, I would say, we privilege the community just because the community is where the rubber hits the road with a lot of these things. So in a lot of the work where it's more on the social side, we tend to prioritize communities and working with communities just because they're sort of the closest to the issues and the actions and things like that. But in that case as well, and Derek knows this very well too, but the governance dimensions are also really important to consider. So through some of the work that we do, we often have a focus on communities, but we're thinking about national policies and international markets and just all these things that are happening at different scales as well. It didn't come out very strongly in the talk that I gave here, is just some of the examples, but a lot of them do have sort of things that are happening at other scales that are enabling or constraining what's happening at the community level. So, and that's kind of, I guess that's sort of my way of, or, that's the way that I would say works well for this, is when you sort of work at the community level, but you try to be mindful of things happening at other scales that enable or constrain adaptive capacity and shape vulnerabilities and things like that. That's definitely not the only way of doing it. There's lots of ways of doing it, but that's kind of one way that I've tackled some of these issues of scale in some of my work.
Jeremy, and another question here from Ana Carolina Diaz. And I would like to ask if you could expand on the technology and local knowledge aspect of V2V.
Yeah, so what I was kind of thinking about there is this whole idea where, a lot of times really well-intentioned and even having really positive outcomes. So something like the freezer in this example, but it's probably the ideas are probably relevant for a lot of different technologies, but you try to get people to use them more and more. But as they're using this new technology, it's almost like they're losing something else. And I think kind of striking that balance can be really hard. So in this case, they're using freezers and ice and things like that, but they're losing sort of the more local ways of preserving fish and whatnot, and that's really good for like that. In a lot of ways, that probably increases their viability, right? But then different stressors come like a hurricane, and because you've changed sort of the vulnerability profile. In some ways, you've actually increased vulnerability to the hurricane because people don't know how to preserve fish without their freezers anymore, right? So that's kind of some of the ideas. One of the things that I've thought through a lot, but it's not really something that we've looked at too much empirically, but a lot of people talk about the roles of like ICTs, like information communication technologies, like cell phones and things like that in small scale fisheries. Which is really great for data collection and things like that. You could see like really interesting ways that it could be used to promote interactions between fishers, with different social media groups or, just all those types of things, getting information to fishers. But again, those types of technologies are really dependent on having cell phone networks and that type of thing. And so if you're ever faced with a stressor where those networks go down, you might have actually inadvertently increased vulnerability to some of these other stressors. So that's some of the linkages that I kind of thought through a little bit in my work. But I would say, and this is where I think the V2V project is really important, is I think there's still a lot of opportunities to actually think through those connections a lot more, and just sort of develop those kind of strategies. In a lot of the climate change literature, we often talk about like no regrets strategies, right? It's where like you can do it and you should be building adaptive capacity for a broad range of things. But I think there's still a lot of opportunities to actually think through those more systematically and develop a more thorough set of that. And, some of it is just like thinking through some of the potential unintended consequences of developing technologies in different communities. But
And I think also the intricate relationship between technology and knowledge
exactly.
is really important, because the moment you bring in new technology that has impact on and it could change the existing knowledge system and vice versa.
Yeah.
And this play out really nicely and needs to be addressed within the discourse of adaptive capacity itself.
Yeah.
We have more questions flowing in. Jessica Blythe from Brock University in Canada. Thank you for your wonderful talk. Jeremy, I had the same question as Derek, and you answered it well. So yeah, people, it is important to look at scale.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just said thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, and there's another question from Mofat Manse. I was expecting to see the application of iAdapt framework in this presentation. Have you tried using this framework in your case study?
So I haven't, but definitely very interested in it. So a lot of this work was done sort of before, V2V. So it, didn't use explicitly the iAdapt framework. I don't top of my head. I don't know every piece of the framework that well, but I would imagine some of the pieces would still kind of fit within the iAdapt framework if you reorganize them and whatnot. But yeah, so I didn't use it explicitly in this, but I imagine some of these things are still kind of relevant for some of it.
Yeah, but there would probably be a future talk on this, because we're just working on that framework at this point, and there are many more case studies that are going to be built and organized using that framework in the future months and years. So we are just in the initial phase of developing the iAdapt framework to do vulnerability to viability case studies. So a question from Lina Maria. Good morning from Colombia. Thanks for your talk. Through the qualitative methods, did you get information about how the communities understand adaptive capacity, or for them what it means?
Yeah, so we got perception. Yeah, so I would say, it's always a tricky thing. So we ask community members sort of what helps them get through situations and things like that. And that's where some of these things come from. Like I'm thinking, in particular, some of these things, why they kind of stick with fishing and what helps them get through. But it's an interesting point, and with a lot of qualitative research, like you start off with these these statements about how what's their day-to-day life like, what do they think, all that kind of stuff, and then we have to kind of abstract it to these big concepts like adaptive capacity, right, and things like that. And so in some ways I'd say we did, just because we're asking about like how what sort of helps them get through these difficult situations, or what helps them have a good life, and that type of thing. But we never ask specifically like what do you think are your adaptive capacities, right? So in some ways it's kind of a combination of we take the information that we gather from community members, and we have to sort of add in these interpretations and analyses of adaptive capacity. So it's kind of, so in some ways yes, but also in some ways no, I would say.
Yeah. But you did also look at, what are the key ingredients or elements of adaptive capacity. So it may not be a definitional, in nature, but,
Yeah.
there is a lot of different things that people seems to have told you in your research, which explains what they might mean by adaptive capacity. The reference to options and alternate livelihoods, and, involvement of different stakeholders, the role of the government and community, and all of those things kind of, directs us towards, the notion of adaptive capacity in that island community itself. So it may not be straightforward, but it is part of the discourse, part of the discussion there.
Yep.
There is one question from Alicia. Thank you for the presentation. Did you find that loans from external institutions or from community members were present in the system? If so, how does this interact with adaptive capacity?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I didn't highlight it much in this talk just because we don't have a lot of empirical work on it, but there were some individuals that had loans for their boats or that type of thing. It was, so those people, I would say, so thinking about Hurricane Maria, some of the people that had loans for their boats, they started fishing a bit earlier, potentially. Like that would be my hypothesis, right? Just based on some of the conversations that I had, they had a little bit more of a push to get back fishing and stuff like that, just because they had to make their loan payments and that type of thing. That said, the loans were a pretty important piece of increasing the viability of the fishery, I would say. And one of the things is like it in a lot of cases, I think it gives younger fishers the opportunity to enter into the fishery as more of a captain and that type of thing, gives them access to actually having a boat. And stuff like that. So they're present. It's not like super widespread, but they're there in this case study. And generally, I'd say that it increases viability, but again, in some ways, it changes that vulnerability profile and things like that. The other thing that came out, it's not really loans, but the other thing that came out, so a lot of people in Dominica, they have family all over the world, right? And lots in Canada and just in other places. And one of the things that, so when you think about those networks and just how they cross scales and stuff like that again, but so in a lot of cases, one of the things is just like being able to get assistance from family members abroad and stuff like that, which isn't really a loan, but it's, a similar kind of idea. That was really helpful for a lot of people getting through some of the impacts of the hurricane.
Yeah. If I may just, ask you about, related to scale, but, in other literature, especially in commons literature, there is this talk about, what makes a successful commons community, whether it needs to be homogeneous, heterogeneous communities. And there's a lot of debate, around that. If we apply the notion of vulnerability and viability to the scale of the community or the size of the community itself, from your experience of studying really very cohesive island communities, vis-a-vis more heterogeneous and diverse and large community elsewhere, how some of these lessons might apply to those completely different communities?
Yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say, in a lot of cases, that idea of diversity, it's really important. I would say it still leads to resilience, or whatever you want to say, in a lot of the communities where I've worked. I'm not sure if that'd be the case everywhere, but just thinking about some of my work, I'd say that'd be the case. But and one example would be one of the really key things would be like diversity in terms of age, just having like different people of different ages in the fishery and things like that. That seems to make them more resilient. Diversity in terms of gender as well, I think, is really important for a lot of these communities. And when you think about, so if you jump up another scale, so it's like more like working like within regions or across communities. The other thing that I think might be important in these islands in the West Indies would be you have cultural diversity as well, kind of community to community, people coming from different cultural backgrounds and stuff like that have like different fishing techniques and that type of thing. So I think outside the community, there's that idea of diversity as well that can increase the viability of like a national fishery, for example. But
yeah, thanks, Jeremy. We have one more question from Derek again, and Derek I'll read it out to you. You raised lots of great examples and insights from the field. Ultimately, what is your assessment overall then of the viability and adaptive capacity of small-scale fisheries in Dominica and the Caribbean, more generally, given climate change and markets? And where then are the most important leverage points where a project like B2B could support? And Derek does recognize that this is a hard question.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It's challenging you, right?
Yeah. So on the coming back to like where we could focus, like, or just my general assessment, I guess, first maybe. But I would say it's kind of in that situation where there's a lot of capacity. There's a lot of really great things happening, and in a lot of like, I know it's not necessarily like a black and white kind of situation, but in a lot of cases, I would say the fisheries here are actually pretty viable. In a lot of the sense of the term, and that'd be sort of throughout the Caribbean, from my experience in other places too. I would say that, but nonetheless, I do think there's a lot of opportunities for kind of increasing the adaptive capacity as well. And I would say, and actually, I would say like this is one of the key ones for myself, is just sort of like this idea of promoting the love of fishing, or almost like, that's related, like I see that related to increasing the weight that fisheries is given in the policy discourse and that type of thing. Like in a lot of places, the fisheries is sort of subsumed within some sort of Ministry of Agriculture, and it's kind of happens over there, and there's a handful of staff, and doesn't have a lot of resources. And kind of more broadly in the discourse, fisheries are still seen as only impacting negatively on biodiversity and things like that. And so I think like there's the possibility of sort of reframing how fisheries is approached and thought of, and that type of thing is one of the most important points to me. Whether or not that's the important point, I'm not totally sure, but for me, that one comes out pretty strong. I can give an example. So we're doing some work in the Galapagos as well, as part of the project that Pete mentioned actually at the beginning. And working with some colleagues there from Charles Darwin Foundation, and Mauricio Castrahan is really leading some of that work for our team. But one of the things that we're finding there is, so with the pandemic, so in the Galapagos, in a lot of cases, small-scale fisheries were kind of vilified for having impact on biodiversity and things like that. And that's obviously something we need to take care of and be mindful of. But during the pandemic, the Galapagos were cut off from mainland Ecuador. It was really hard to get food. And what they were observing there is that it actually changed how fisheries were perceived by the broader community, because the fishers became one of the main local sources of quality protein. They modified their selling strategies, where before they were selling largely to tourists, they started selling more largely to community members. In the news and all that kind of stuff, they started to become like the hero of the story a little bit. And I think that type of reframing is really important. And I think it just makes small scale fisheries more viable for a number of reasons. But it increases sort of the economic element of it, but also if you're always being told you're doing the wrong thing, that can be kind of wearing on fishers and stuff too. So once they start getting more recognition for the important role that they play, I think that's important just in terms of, well-being and stuff, and sort of advancing viability in sort of a more multi-dimensional sense for communities. But I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
yeah, I mean, thanks, Jeremy. And yes, there is another question just popped up, so by Ali Dabundi from Canada. Thank you for the presentation, Jeremy. You described adaptive capacity well, but I was wondering if you could talk more about your understanding of viability.
Yeah, that's one that's emerging. So, from an academic sense, I don't think there's been a lot, like there's been some, right? But mostly on economic viability. The way that I've been approaching viability so far, and again, this might kind of change, but the way that I've been thinking about it is it's related to livelihoods and things like that. And the economics is there. But I also think about it a little bit more in terms of like having functioning communities where people are sort of happy with their situations. There's always going to be some conflict, but places where there's not a lot of conflict potentially, between people or between communities and their broader societies. So yeah, like I think my interpretation of viability kind of, includes some of those elements as well, where it's about people sort of having the lives that they want, not just being able to earn a living, but also having the lives that they want. And I kind of tie it to happiness a little bit, I guess, as I'm talking through this, right? I don't know if that's totally appropriate or if that's the right way of doing it, but when I think about it, I kind of tie it to happiness as well.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that brings in a new dimension here is in B2B, we really mean by calling it B2B, so it's kind of a continuum, it's not vulnerability and viability and exploring them both, and therefore you have a different understanding of vulnerability from viability. But if you look at vulnerability and viability on a continuum, it's kind of turns out into a process. And therefore, at any given point of time, there could be communities that are not fully viable or fully vulnerable. There are elements from a systems theory point of view of the system that are more vulnerable, and some elements of that system could be, more viable. How do you see that kind of a continuum in the context of your research, Jeremy? Because no system can effectively be either viable or vulnerable, given all the external, stressors and everything that is happening, especially in the island communities. There are so many exposures that they have to deal with in terms of their vulnerability and viability. So how do you see this as a process, as a continuum?
Yes, and I think some of the examples that I was given with the technology kind of highlight some of that process a little bit. Where it's like at any one given point, you're kind of applying, you're trying to reduce vulnerabilities and things like that, and to make things more viable. But you still there still are kind of vulnerabilities present, and it's sort of this ongoing process where vulnerabilities and viabilities are sort of interacting and shaping one another, and that kind of thing. Yeah, and I would say like in the process framing of vulnerability to viability, I think that's where adaptive capacity comes out really strong. Is this that whole idea of like, that process is sort of playing out with this capacity as kind of latent, and people are making it manifest through their actions and whatnot. And that sort of has this ongoing, process of kind of shaping what viability looks like or what vulnerability looks like. So I think like I definitely agree with that framing of it. And that it sort of is this continuum, and it's not necessarily like one or the other, right? And like they're shaping each other, but it's kind of always in this state of flux between the two, right?
Yeah. And therefore the meanings and the definitions, there was a question about the definitions of, and perceptions of communities is going to vary from time to time, so depending on what they're experiencing in terms of their vulnerability would change the perceptions about the kinds of viability they might be looking at. There's one question, and before that, Derek confirms that your response was a great response.
Thanks. Thanks, Derek.
So thanks for that. So Rob Fike from Canada, University of Waterloo. Rob is saying, thanks for the excellent presentation, Jeremy. I have a similar question to Lina's. do you feel that understanding of adaptive capacity is widely held, and does it differ between and within communities?
So definitely the latter, I'd say yes. Like it differs within communities quite a bit and across communities and things like that. I think that kind of highlights the context specific nature of adaptive capacities. So when we're going through this, we're trying to synthesize across all those ideas and present kind of the breadth of them. But they definitely does kind of differ between individuals or households and communities and all that kind of stuff. And I would say like it's sort of, in terms of like whether or not there's a broad sense, I think it's there. It's not necessarily something that's always top of people's minds, and anybody that's done these interviews probably kind of knows like through the interviews you can kind of draw it out and people get thinking a little bit more about it. So they're definitely aware of it, but I don't know if they've ever thought about some of these things in those terms, right? In terms of it being a capacity or so I'd say like there is kind of a broad awareness of that some of these things are important, but again, it kind of differs person to person. And some of the ways that are questions as you kind of walk through them, they kind of get people thinking in about this in a little bit more detail than they might have otherwise, right? But yeah, that's I don't know, that's kind of my general impression about that. I think.
Yeah, and we had this discussion earlier in your talk, about how this could differ, not geographically, but also the size of the community could also matter in terms of the understanding and all. Yeah, so I think we don't have any questions. So we have a bit of time if anyone wants to ask questions, but I'm happy to bring it to a close, given that the rich discussion that has already taken place, and you might be hearing directly from some of our viewers and participants via email. And of course, I would love to talk to you about the idea of adaptive capacity as a core element of vulnerability to viability itself. Okay. Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was wonderful because you spoke, directly to the core elements of B2B and what we are trying to do within the global partnership here. There is much to follow up. There is much to kind of, take forward. Of course, fortunately, you are part of this journey, so we don't have to do much, just to connect back and then, do it collaboratively and together. Thank you very much for your time. And
awesome.
Okay. Before we close, I would request Seville Berenji to bring up the poster for our next thematic webinar. As I mentioned, so this webinar takes place on the last Friday of every month, and that has been the case all through the 2021. But December being December, we don't have a last Friday available to us. So this is going to be on a different Friday in December, which is the 17th of December. Which is a Friday, but not last Friday. And fortunately, we have a wonderful speaker, Ana Carolina Diaz. And Ana is going to speak about uncovering well-being ecosystem services bundles, which it calls WEBs, under conditions of social ecological changes. And I am pretty sure that Ana is going to connect it to not only vulnerability to viability, but also small-scale fisheries and coastal communities in a very intense way from her studies that she has done in Brazil. So we're looking forward to that, and we welcome all of you and invite all of you to join us on 17th December to listen to Ana next month. Thank you very much, everyone, and the audience, especially for those wonderful questions and generating such a meaningful discussion on a topic that is so core to most of our hearts. And we will pursue this. We will continue this not through seminars and discussions like this, but also in real action in those communities that we are involved in. So we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar, especially next month. And goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.